They said I inherited a useless canyon at 18. They said it the way people say things they have already decided. Not as an observation open to revision, but as a conclusion delivered before the evidence, because the evidence in their understanding was the canyon itself. The canyon was visible from the main street of Harlan County on clear days as a dark line against the eastern sky, and everyone in Harlan County had looked at that dark line for as long as anyone could remember and reached the same verdict. Dry gulch, dead rock. 38 acres of nothing, enclosed by basalt walls that the county survey document described, in a parenthetical notation as having no water, no access, and no value. The lawyer who read the will looked up from the document and looked at me across the table with the expression of a man trying to be kind about something he considers unfortunate. He said my grandfather had left me the canyon. He paused the way people pause after delivering news they expect to land badly. Around the table there were 4 other people, 2 cousins, an uncle, and a neighbor, who had received his portion earlier and was staying out of curiosity. None of them said anything immediately, but 2 of them smiled, not unkindly. The smile of people who have just watched someone receive something they are certain is worthless and are quietly relieved it wasn't given to them. I looked at the lawyer and said nothing. I signed the papers he placed in front of me. I folded my copy and put it in the inside pocket of my coat. I walked out of the office into the spring light and stood on the main street of Harlan for a long moment, looking east at the dark line against the sky. Then I went home and packed what I needed and started walking. This is the story of what I found inside that canyon, of what my grandfather had been building there for 30 years before he left it to me, and of why 20 years after the will was read and the cousins smiled, every family in Harlan County was eating something that had come from those 38 acres the lawyer described as no water, no access, no value. If you stay until the end, you'll understand what my grandfather understood, and what he spent a lifetime trying to teach me, about the difference between what land looks like from the outside and what it holds on the inside. My name is Ren Calloway. I was 18 years old when this story began, which meant I was old enough to sign documents and young enough that the men of Harlan County did not take seriously anything I said about land or water or what a canyon could produce if you understood it correctly. I had been saying things about the canyon since I was old enough to repeat what my grandfather told me, and I had been watching. A resposta do Claude foi interrompida a tentar, novamente. Comece desde o início. Todos roteiro mar. 28 organizou estratégia para gerar 4 roteiros completos, sequencialmente. Organizou estratégia para gerar 4 roteiros completos, sequencialmente. Vou gerar os 4 roteiros em sequência, um por vez, cada um com identificação, mínimo 4.200 palavras e nota no final. Começando pelo roteiro 01, roteiro 01, Old West Legends. Título: Expelled at Waitain, she sealed a mountain cave with barnwood. They were the last ones still standing. Protagonista: Ada Crane. Estrutura: E1. Montanha Hook, C. Pergunta impossível ao espectador. Target: 4.200 palavras mínimo. Nota mínima aceitável: 9.0. What would you do if you were 18 years old, cast out in October, with nothing but a horse, a bundle, and 3 days before the first snow, and the only shelter available was a cave that everyone in the county had walked past for 30 years without stopping? Most people would turn back. Most people would ride to a neighbor, a church, a town, anywhere that had walls already standing and a fire already burning. Most people would choose the known thing over the unknown thing, because the known thing is warm, and the unknown thing is a hole in the side of a mountain that nobody has found a use for in living memory. Ada Crane did not turn back. She rode into the mountain with barnwood strapped to the horse's back, and a notebook full of her father's observations in her coat pocket, and she disappeared so completely that by November the men of Caldwell had stopped talking about where she had gone. By December they had stopped caring. And in January, when the worst blizzard in 30 years arrived from the northwest without warning, and the county lost more livestock and more stored food and more structural integrity than it had lost in a generation, the question of where Ada Crane had gone became suddenly and urgently more important than anyone had expected it to become. Because from the eastern ridge, visible to anyone who looked in that direction, in the grey morning after the storm broke, there was smoke. A thin, steady column of it, rising from the mountain face, at a point that none of the men of Caldwell could identify as the location of any structure they knew about. Not the panicked smoke of a fire lit against extreme cold by someone who had not planned for it. The steady smoke of a fire that had been burning regularly for weeks, in a structure that was not struggling, tended by someone who had not been surprised by any of this. This is the story of what Ada built inside that mountain, of what she understood about cold and stone, and the way barnwood behaves when you need it to do something it was never designed to do, and of why, when the blizzard finally broke and the men of Caldwell rode out to count what remained, the only smoke still rising in the eastern valley was coming from a cave that everyone had walked past for 30 years without stopping. If you stay until the end, you will understand what Ada understood the morning she was cast out. That a cave is only a hole in the ground until someone decides what to hold inside it. Ada Crane had been cast out on a Thursday in the second week of October, which was later in the season than she would have chosen if she had been given a choice, which she had not. The man who cast her out was her stepfather, Conrad Marsh, who had married her mother 4 years before, and who had spent those 4 years making increasingly clear that the property he had acquired through the marriage was not intended to support a stepdaughter who asked questions he could not answer and kept notes on things he preferred people not to document. Her mother had died in August. By October, Conrad Marsh had decided that the period of decency required by custom had elapsed, and that the property arrangement could now be regularized in his favor. He told her she had 3 days to clear her belongings. She took 2. She packed what she could carry in 2 saddlebags and 1 bundle tied behind the saddle, not in haste, not in grief, but with the unhurried precision of someone who had known since August that this conversation was coming, and had used the intervening weeks to prepare for it before it arrived. She had spent those weeks doing 3 things simultaneously: sorting what she would take from what she would leave, reading every page of her father's notebooks twice, and making 2 quiet trips into the eastern mountain range to confirm what the notebooks described. Her father was her biological father, who had died when she was 11. He had been a man of careful habits and methodical observation, a former surveyor who had come to Caldwell County when Ada was an infant and spent the years before his death walking the terrain around the settlement with a notebook and a pencil, and the specific patience of someone who believed that landscape rewarded sustained attention in ways that were not always immediately visible. He had filled 9 notebooks in 11 years. He had left them to Ada with the explicit instruction, written on the inside cover of the first one, that they were not to be shared with anyone who had not earned them by understanding what they described. Ada had earned them. She had been reading them since she was old enough to follow the sentences, and she had been walking the terrain they described since she was old enough to walk it without getting tired. The cave was in the 4th notebook, page 31, described in her father's precise shorthand, with enough detail that Ada had been able to find it on her first solo visit at age 14, without using anything except the written description and her own legs. She arrived at the cave entrance at midday on the 2nd day of her departure, having spent the first night at a natural rock shelter she had also found in the notebooks, a half-day's ride from the property, adequate for a single night, nothing more. The horse was calm on the mountain trail, which was a reliable indicator that the trail was passable and the ground not yet frozen at this elevation. She tied the horse at the entrance, unloaded everything, and walked the full length of the cave before doing anything else. 40 feet of entrance chamber, narrowing at the midpoint before opening into a rear chamber that her father had estimated at 30 by 30 feet. She had been here twice before. She walked it again because every time you walk a space with new purpose, you see things you missed the time before. The rear chamber temperature was what her father had promised. She held the mercury thermometer from the saddlebag at arm's length in the center of the space for 10 minutes and read the result. 21 degrees above zero. Outside the entrance, the morning air had been 9 above. The differential was 12 degrees. The thermal mass of the basalt walls charging and releasing heat in the slow cycle of dense stone that takes months to fully charge and releases over weeks. Her father had measured this differential in December and found it at 21 degrees above the outside air. She was measuring it in October and finding 12. The trajectory was in the right direction. The barn wood was the critical variable. She had taken it from the property's collapsed outbuilding. 8 boards, grey and weathered, and dried to a low moisture content by years of exposure, selected for their straightness and dimensional consistency. They were not enough to build a wall. They were exactly enough to build a baffle, a partial barrier across the cave entrance that reduced the volume of cold air reaching the rear chamber without sealing the entrance completely, which would have created the ventilation and condensation problems her father had described in the notebooks in the context of underground construction in winter. She spent the rest of the first day building the baffle. She used the rock face on either side of the entrance as the structural support, pressing the board ends into notches she cut in the sediment floor with the short-handled pick. She stacked the boards in an overlapping pattern with deliberate gaps at the top for airflow and at the base for drainage. The result was not a door. It was a reduction. The entrance opening narrowed from 22 feet wide and 8 feet tall to an effective gap of approximately 4 feet by 4 feet at the upper center, where cold air, being heavier than warm, would not naturally flow through unless driven by wind pressure stronger than the southeast-facing entrance typically received. She tested it at sunset with a candle flame at the gap. The flame bent inward, toward the interior, which meant the airflow was moving in the wrong direction. She adjusted one board, widening the gap by 2 inches higher on the left side. Tested again. The flame bent outward. She made a note in the notebook she had started for her own observations alongside her father's, recording the board configuration and the candle test result with the date and the outside temperature. Then she lit the fire in the rear chamber. What she discovered in that first cave is not something anyone in Caldwell would have believed if she had described it to them, but what mattered that night was simpler than belief. Within 2 hours of the fire, the rear chamber was warmer than the outside air by a margin she could feel on her skin. The walls were beginning to charge. She banked the fire for sleeping, wrapped herself in the wool blanket from the saddlebag, and slept better than she had in the 2 months since August. Nobody in Caldwell knew where she was. Nobody was looking for her with any urgency. The men of the county had too many other things to occupy them as October moved toward November, with the specific character that experienced eyes in that climate read as a warning. The quality of the light in the western sky before sunset, the behavior of the livestock in the late afternoon, the direction and persistence of the wind from the northwest that came earlier in the season than it usually came. What Ada was doing in the mountain while the county read those warnings was not surviving. She had what she needed to survive from the first week. The spring her father had documented at the northeast corner of the cave system provided clean cold water. The entrance baffle reduced the heating load to what a small fire could manage. The food she had packed was enough for 2 months at careful rationing, and she had identified 3 additional food sources in the terrain around the cave from the notebooks before she left the property. Survival was not the question she was answering. The question she was answering was more specific and more demanding than survival. She was answering the question of how to build something inside a mountain that would still be standing and still be useful when January arrived with whatever it intended to bring. November arrived, and with it the sustained cold that confirmed what the October sky had been suggesting. The temperature on the valley floor dropped below zero in the first week, earlier than any year in the previous decade, and with a consistency that did not moderate in the way that early cold sometimes moderates before the real winter arrives. The creek on the valley floor froze on the 7th of November. The well at the Marsh property, which had never frozen in 20 years of record-keeping, showed ice in the bucket on the 14th. In the mountain, Ada was learning the cave the way her father had described learning any terrain, not in a single visit, but in repeated passes at different times of day and in different weather conditions, each pass revealing something the previous passes had not shown. She walked the full system 3 times in the first week of November, mapping what her father had documented and what he had not. The 4th notebook described the main chamber system with precision: entrance chamber, narrowing passage, rear chamber, and one additional passage running northeast from the rear chamber's back wall that her father had noted as unexplored beyond the first 20 feet. Ada explored it beyond the first 20 feet on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of November, carrying 2 candles and the pick. The passage ran for 60 feet before opening into a chamber that her father had never found, a room approximately 25 feet across and 15 feet high, with a ceiling that domed rather than being flat, and a floor that was covered in a deeper accumulation of the fine mineral sediment than anywhere else in the system. The temperature in this chamber she measured at 31 degrees above zero with no fire and no proximity to the thermally charged walls of the rear chamber. The room had its own heat source. She dug into the sediment floor to find it and found what she had not expected to find: a seam of reddish-brown material running northeast to southwest across the floor at 18 inches depth, dense and metallic sounding when the pick struck it, with the specific visual signature that her father's mineral notes in the 7th notebook had described as potentially significant. She covered the seam carefully and went back to the rear chamber with 3 separate things running simultaneously in her mind: the temperature reading that needed recording, the mineral identification that needed the 7th notebook, and the understanding that she had found something in this mountain that her father had not known was there. She wrote everything in her own notebook before she opened the 7th. Then she sat with the 7th notebook for 2 hours, reading the mineral section from the beginning. Then she made 2 decisions that she kept entirely to herself for the following 3 months. She would document the seam systematically before telling anyone it existed, and she would register her continuous occupation of the cave system with the Territorial Land Office before spring. She was still 18 years old. She had no money to pay a lawyer. She had a notebook, a mercury thermometer, a pick, 8 boards of barnwood, and the 7th notebook's mineral section. It was enough to begin. What she built in November was less visible than the water system and the baffle and the food storage she had organized in the rear chamber. But it was the most important thing she built that month. She built a record. Every morning before lighting the first fire, she recorded the rear chamber temperature, the outside temperature, the wind direction, the weather conditions. Every time she walked the new chamber, she recorded its temperature at 3 points: entrance, center, and far wall, and the date and the time. Every observation of the spring's output she measured and recorded. She was building a document that would be, at the end of the winter, a precise and verifiable account of what the cave system was and what it was capable of and what she had been doing in it since October. Her father's notebooks had taught her this. Not directly. He had not written instructions for how to document a mineral find or how to establish occupancy rights, but the notebooks themselves were the instruction. 30 years of careful daily observation, recorded with date and temperature and wind direction, had produced documents that were impossible to dispute because they were too specific to have been invented. She intended to produce the same kind of document. It would take longer than one winter. She was 18, she had time. December in Caldwell County was the coldest anyone under 60 could remember. The temperature reached 22 below zero on the 14th and held there for 4 days, a sustained cold event that the county office thermometer had not recorded in its 22 years of operation. Pipes froze in the buildings that had them. The horses at the livery stable required double the usual bedding and still lost condition. 3 families moved into the stone church at the center of town, which was the only structure in Caldwell built from material that did not conduct cold the way wood conducted cold. 2 families lost animals to the cold in a single night when the temperature dropped faster than anyone had prepared for. Conrad Marsh burned through his 3rd cord of wood by the 18th of December. He purchased a 4th cord from the Vance family at December prices, which were not October prices. He was warm enough. His animals were cold enough to be losing weight, which meant losing value, which meant the spring would cost more than the fall already had. He did not think about Ada Crane with any frequency. He had resolved that situation in October, and it had been resolved cleanly, and he had moved forward. If he thought about her at all, it was briefly and without discomfort, the way a man thinks about a decision he has already justified to himself. In the cave, Ada had not used her 2nd cord yet. The rear chamber was running 31 degrees above zero in the mornings, 4 degrees higher than her October baseline, because the thermal mass of the basalt walls had fully stabilized over 8 weeks of regular firing. She had achieved this increase through 2 interventions. First, she had hung 2 wool blankets across the narrowed passage between the entrance chamber and the rear chamber in early November, creating a 2nd thermal barrier that was less effective than the barnwood baffle at the entrance, but measurably effective. She had recorded a 4-degree improvement in rear chamber morning temperature within the 1st week of hanging them. Second, she had moved the fire position 2 feet closer to the north wall, where the basalt was thickest, increasing the rate at which that wall was charging during each firing session. The fire she built each evening was small. She had calibrated the minimum fuel load required to maintain the wall temperature overnight, and she was using exactly that amount, no more, because wasting fuel in winter was the kind of mistake that compounded over weeks into a shortage she had no way to remedy. She had enough wood for 3 more months at her current consumption rate. She had enough food for 6 more weeks. She had supplemented her stored food twice with material she had found in the terrain around the cave, dried berries and pine nuts from locations her father had documented, not enough to live on alone, but enough to extend her food supply significantly when combined with what she had brought. She was not comfortable. She was not warm in the way that people in houses with proper stoves are warm. She was warm enough, precisely warm enough, calibrated to the minimum survivable, and then incrementally improved as she understood the cave system better. The distinction between comfort and sufficiency was one she had made consciously in October and had maintained through 2 months of evidence. Comfort was a target that moved. Sufficiency was a target that could be defined and met. She had defined it, and she was meeting it, and she was spending the energy she was not using on comfort, on building the record and documenting the new chamber and extending her understanding of what the cave system was and what it was capable of beyond this single winter. The men of Caldwell who were burning their 4th cord of wood in December did not know any of this. They knew in a vague and unexamined way that the stepdaughter of Conrad Marsh had gone somewhere in October and had not come back. They had other things to think about. What was coming in January would change that. The blizzard arrived on the 9th of January at 3 in the morning. Ada knew it was coming before she slept on the 8th. The barometric pressure, reading she had been taking every evening with the instrument from the 4th notebook, dropped sharply between the 6 o'clock reading and the 9 o'clock reading, a drop of a magnitude she had not seen in the 3 months of daily recordings. She added wood to the fire before sleeping, bringing the rear chamber temperature up from its evening steady state to the maximum the space could hold, 37 degrees above zero at the height of the fire, which would fall through the night as the fire burned down, but would fall from a higher baseline than usual. She heard the wind change at 3, not loudly. The cave entrance absorbed sound the way it absorbed cold, reducing what the interior experienced to a muffled version of what was happening outside. But the quality of the sound changed. The irregular gusts of the previous weeks became a sustained pressure, constant, not varying in the way that normal wind varied, the kind of pressure that meant the storm had arrived at full force rather than building toward it. She did not go to the entrance to look. She had looked at enough winter storms from exposed positions to know that looking was not useful, and that the information she needed, temperature, snow accumulation, wind direction, could be gathered more safely and more accurately at first light than at 3 in the morning in a blizzard. She rebuilt the fire to a level that would sustain the rear chamber temperature through the remaining hours of darkness, checked the baffle boards for any shifting caused by the wind pressure, found them stable, and went back to sleep. At first light, the blizzard had not broken. She checked the entrance chamber. The snow had drifted against the baffle boards on the outside. She could see it through the upper gap. But the boards had held, and the drift was acting as additional insulation rather than a problem, sealing the lower half of the gap against cold air infiltration, while leaving the upper gap clear for ventilation. The candle flame at the upper gap bent outward. Air was still moving in the right direction. She stayed inside for 3 days. She had prepared for this. The water basin she had built in the alcove beside the spring held 3 days of supply without needing to be replenished. The food she had portioned for contingency was in the rear chamber. The wood was stacked where she could reach it without going past the baffle. She spent the 3 days doing what she'd been doing all winter, recording temperatures, writing observations, reading the 7th notebook's mineral section for the 14th time, and sleeping in the intervals when there was nothing productive to do, and rest was the most useful investment of the time available. On the morning of the 12th, the wind dropped. She went to the entrance and looked out through the upper gap. The snow had stopped. The eastern valley below was white and still, and without a single smoke column rising from any structure she could see, which meant either that no one below had a fire burning, or that the smoke was being suppressed by a cold inversion layer sitting on the valley floor. She could not determine which from this distance. She made a note of the observation with the time and the temperature, 14 below zero at the cave entrance, and went back to the rear chamber and lit the morning fire. The smoke from her fire rose. She had not thought about whether it would be visible from below. She had thought about ventilation and thermal dynamics and fuel consumption. She had not thought about the optics of a visible smoke column rising from a mountain face that no one in Caldwell associated with any inhabited structure. 3 men arrived at the cave entrance at midday on the 13th of January. She heard them before she saw them, voices on the approach trail, the sound of horses picking through snow, the particular cadence of people who are moving carefully rather than people who know where they are going. She stood at the entrance side of the baffle and waited. There was no advantage in going out to meet them, and no advantage in hiding. She waited. The tallest one, the Vance boy, who was not a boy, but who everyone still called that because he had been the Vance boy when the name was appropriate, and the name had stayed, stopped at the baffle boards and looked at them for a moment before speaking. He said that the valley had taken serious losses in the storm. He said there were families without adequate heat, and animals that had not made it through, and food stores that were not going to last the winter at the consumption rates the cold was forcing. He said it plainly, without asking anything, The way people state facts they are not sure how to turn into a request. Ada looked at him through the gap in the baffle. Then she looked at the two men behind him. Then she looked at the valley beyond them, still white and still, the cold settling over it with the specific weight of a cold that intends to stay. She told them who could come. She told them what to bring and what not to bring, and how to navigate the trail when the light was bad, which it would be every morning for the next 6 weeks. She told them the rear chamber could hold 12 people, and that the animals could come in pairs through the entrance chamber if the timing was staggered. She told them the wood she had was sufficient for everyone through February, if the fire was managed the way she would show them to manage it. Not the way people manage fires in houses, where wood is abundant and efficiency is not the priority, but the way she had been managing it since October, the way that made the supply last because the supply had to last. She gave them this information the way her father had given information, completely, without withholding. Because information about survival in winter is not something you negotiate with. It is something you share or you don't, and the consequences of not sharing it are not yours to carry alone. They went back down the mountain and came back with 11 people and 9 animals over the following 3 days. Ada managed the space. She assigned positions for sleeping based on body heat distribution and proximity to the thermally charged walls. She rationed the wood using the same calculation she had been using since October. Minimum fuel load to maintain sufficiency. No more. She took the barometric reading every evening and told the people in the cave what to expect in the morning, which they had stopped asking her to explain and had started simply believing, because the predictions had been accurate for 3 months, and accuracy is its own explanation. Conrad Marsh was not among those who came to the cave. He had managed his own situation through the storm, and he had managed it at cost. Animals lost, wood purchased at emergency prices, a long winter still ahead. He was aware, in the way that people are aware of things they have not examined directly, that the stepdaughter he had cast out in October was the reason 11 people and 9 animals were alive in the eastern valley when the January blizzard broke. He did not go to the mountain. He did not send word. He had nothing to say that the situation had not already said more clearly than he could have said it. On the 20th of January, the cold broke. The temperature rose from 14 below to 4 above in a single afternoon. The shift that comes when the pressure system that has been holding the cold in place finally moves, and the air that was cold for weeks becomes merely cold for days. Ada walked to the cave entrance and stood in the light for the first time in 10 days. The valley below was beginning to show smoke columns from the structures that still had fires and fuel. The damage was visible even from this distance: collapsed barn roof lines, snow drifts against structures that were no longer generating enough heat to melt them from the inside. She looked at the valley for a long time. Then she went back inside and opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date and the temperature and a single line of observation. Storm passed. All 11 present, all 9 animals present, wood supply at 40%, food supply at 60%, systems functional. Then she closed the notebook and went to check the water basin, because the basin needed checking every morning, regardless of what else was happening, and the morning was not finished. In March, the Territorial Mineral Survey assessor arrived at the cave with 2 assistants and spent 4 days in the 4th chamber, documenting the seam Ada had covered and covered again through the winter. He submitted his assessment to the Territorial Office in April. The registration confirmation arrived in June, a document that described the mineral rights as belonging to Ada Crane, registered continuously from October of the previous year, with her father's original survey notes as prior documentation of the site. Conrad Marsh received a copy of the registration as adjacent property holder. He set it on the table and looked at it for a time. Then he put it in the drawer where he kept documents he had not yet decided what to do with. He never opened that drawer again to look at it, but he never threw it away either. The cave does not remember who doubted it. It only remembers who stayed.